There's a moment in every long investigation where the question changes. For years, the question was, what happened? Who were they? Where did the story fracture? How did distance keep the truth apart for so long? But eventually the evidence catches up. The names are restored, the files are aligned, the pattern becomes undeniable. And the question shifts, not what happened, but what now? Because accountability is not discovery. It's not the same thing as understanding. And it's never the same thing as restoration. By the time this case reaches a courtroom in West Texas, the asshat responsible is already serving life in another state. He will never again move freely across the highways that once hid his crimes. He will never return to the sleeper cab that functioned as both transport and prison. On paper, the system has already done its work, and yet, two Western homicides, separated by miles, years, and jurisdiction, still demand something formal, something recorded, something acknowledged in a way that cannot be dismissed as rumor or inference. A courtroom does not give back what was taken. It does not rewind the moment that Patricia, Walsh, and Douglas Zyskowski accepted a ride they believed would carry them safely forward. It does not restore the years that families lived in uncertainty, wondering whether silence meant survival or something far worse. What a courtroom does is different. It establishes fact, it assigns responsibility, it draws a line in the public record that says, this happened and this is who did it. That line is important because without it, distance wins. Without it, silence remains ambiguous. And without it, the story can still fracture. In episode 1, we talked about faith on the open road, about how trust, geography, and isolation created the conditions for this crime to unfold unseen. In episode 2, we watched those fractures collapse under preserved evidence and coordination. Now in episode 3, we confront what happens when accountability finally arrives, decades late, incomplete in its reach, but real. We will look at how Texas positioned itself as the place where everything converged. We will examine why Utah stepped aside. We will explore what the families gained and what no legal outcome can ever return. And we will sit with the harder questions that lingers beyond the guilty plea. When justice arrives this late, is it closure or simply coincidence? This is not a story about spectacle. It is not about the theater of capital punishment. It is about what remains after the investigation ends, after the evidence is presented, after the sentence is imposed, after the headlines fade. Because reckoning is not always loud. Sometimes it is measured. Sometimes it is procedural. And sometimes it is simply the act of refusing to let a story end in silence. So tonight, we step into that courtroom and we ask what justice can and cannot do. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hey, John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Yeah. Better than something.
Well, that's good. Better than something.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I'll take it.
So where are you at with this freaking case so far?
I don't like it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't like it.
Yeah, yeah,
Where are you at? You don't like it either?
I don't like this piece of shit, that's for sure. You know, I don't like what he did.
Yeah.
He's a disgusting bastard, and it's always difficult. We do this more on Rocky Mountain Reckoning than we do on the main show, where we talk about serial offenders and multiple victims and the potential of a lot more victims.
Yeah.
And so those always hit a little bit different. You know, they just do.
Yeah. He's just gross.
Yeah, he's a sick bastard.
I guess gross is just a very mild word for what he is, but
Yeah.
ah.
So welcome back, listeners. This is Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the series where we return to the crimes rooted deep in the dirt and the snow of the American West, the ones that never left the hearts of the people who lived through them.
We investigate the stories buried under snowfall, prairie dust, and decades of unanswered questions. The ones whispered through cattle fences, past broken barbed wire stretches across open ranges, and along wind-lashed highways that seem to go on forever.
In this final chapter of the Walsh and Zyskowski case, we move from investigation to accountability. The names have been restored, the evidence has been tested, the jurisdictions have aligned. Now the story enters a West Texas courtroom, where two Western homicides separated by distance and time finally converge under a single proceeding.
This is where the system has to decide what justice looks like decades after the fact, where families sit in the same room as the man who carried their loved ones across state lines, where consequence becomes public record.
If you value long-form, evidence-driven investigations like this, the kind that slow down and follow the record instead of the rumor, help us keep doing it. Hit subscribe, follow the show, give this episode a thumbs up on YouTube, leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. Those small actions tell platforms to keep pushing real investigative work instead of noise.
And share this episode with someone who believes accountability still matters, even when it arrives years later.
Tonight, we step into the accountability phase. We examine how Texas positioned itself as the forum for both murders, why Utah stepped aside, what leverage prosecutors had, and what justice can and cannot accomplish after decades of delay. This is episode 3, The Reckoning. So West Texas does not dress itself up for ceremony. The courthouse in Sutton County sits under a wide, unbroken sky, brick, stone, and sun-bleached steps that have seen ranchers, oil workers, and defendants in equal measure. Inside, the air carries that familiar mix of old paper, polished wood, and quiet restraint. No cameras sweeping, no spectacle, no dramatic music swelling beneath the proceedings, just fluorescent lights, a judge's bench worn smooth at the edges, 12 chairs where a jury could sit, and rows of wooden benches where families take their places. The seal of the state of Texas hangs above the bench, not ornate, not theatrical, just a reminder that this room is where the state speaks formally. On one side, prosecutors stack binders thick with timelines, lab reports, and interstate coordination that took years to assemble. And on the other, defense counsel sits beside a man in prison blues. Older now, uglier than shit, fatter, gray at the temples, a man who once moved freely across I-10 and I-15, whose life narrowed to concrete walls long ago. But who is here because two murders tied to this county demanded to be named in open court? There's no shouting, there's no cinematic confrontation, just the low shuffle of files, the scrape of chair legs on tile, the quiet murmur of families who have waited decades to hear something final. Patricia Walsh Zyskowski, Douglas Scott Zyskowski, their names will be spoken here, not as missing persons, not as Jane Doe and John Doe, not as fragments in separate states, but together in a courtroom built for procedure, not for performance. And that is where accountability begins. So by March of 2012, there's no investigative gaps left to close. The victims have been identified, the DNA has been tested, the trucking routes have been mapped, the jurisdictions have aligned, and what remains is formal acknowledgement. In late March 2012, Robert Ben Rhoades, mid-60s, already serving life without parole in Illinois for the murder of Regina Kay Walters, stands before a judge in Sutton County, Texas.
I have to say, I'm shocked you did not choke on his name.
Oh man, this guy is such a disgusting piece of shit.
Yeah.
And what did I think he went by Bob.
Really?
Yeah, on the outside.
Bob's a bad name. Come on.
I just think it's interesting how, I've always said that this is very interesting how assassins and serial killers so often get their full name. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Assassins always do. Always.
Right.
But it's just interesting how that works. I don't know. It's just interesting.
Okay.
But Robert Ben Rhoades.
Ben.
And if you haven't looked at a picture of the dude, he is one ugly son of a bitch. I think in doing research for this, I actually found multiple pictures of him when he was younger and married. And he wasn't like a bad looking guy, really.
So what happened?
I think he had I don't know. I dug and dug.
Okay.
I found actually two different things that said, one, he had a stroke, and the other one was he got beat against a wall in prison and it like jacked his face up. I don't know what's true.
I choose to believe the second.
It sounds, it makes me happy to say that.
Yeah. It might sound like a horrible person, but just desserts.
But I definitely cannot say with any kind of fact that that's what happened. Okay. And I can't say that the stroke thing happened either, but I can say that it would be unusual stroke behavior. Like that is an indication that you're having a stroke, but usually, the damage from the stroke affects like the entire side of your body.
Yeah.
He would be like paralyzed. I think it's on the left side of his face that it's all droopy and shit. And that it would affect his arm, his leg. Yeah. It'd be very strange for it to just be his face. Oh, I also read that it was Bell's palsy. Definitely possible.
So for all the shit that he's done, I'm choosing to believe all three.
Yeah, that would be good. Bell's palsy.
Yeah. Let's get all three in.
Is some miserable shit. I had that. I thought I was having a stroke. I ran to the emergency room. It freaked me out. Like it was, I can't remember which side of the face it was now. It was my right side. The whole right side of my face went numb. My lip drooped. My eye, and I went in. I thought I was having a stroke for sure.
Yeah.
But it didn't affect my limbs at all, just my face. And so I went in, they diagnosed me with Bell's palsy, and then they were like, some people it's there forever. Others, it goes away.
Were you triggered or something? What?
They can't really tell you what causes it, but it is like a inflammation of the nerve that runs like under your ear and then controls the muscles of your face. And I ended up doing like a bunch of homeopathic remedies. I can't remember. It was something like cod liver oil or some shit in my ear every day. And it went away actually pretty quick, but it was miserable. I had to like tape my eyes shut to sleep at night because I couldn't blink. So yeah, it sucked, and constantly put in that gel eye drop shit but my face did look like that until it went away. So it could be Bell's palsy. I think for most people it goes away, but for this sorry son of a bitch, if it is, I hope it never goes away.
Exactly.
Anyway.
He's still alive, right?
We'll get there.
Foreshadowing.
So anyway, he is not there to argue. He's not there to contest. He's there to plead. He formally pleads guilty to 2 counts of capital murder: the abduction and murder of Patricia or Candy Walsh and Douglas Scott Zyskowski in 1990. 2 counts, 2 named victims, 2 Western homicides that began as fractured reports across multiple states. So the plea agreement is straightforward. In exchange for admitting his guilt on both capital counts, Texas removes the death penalty from consideration. He receives 2 additional life sentences without the possibility of parole, stacked on top of the life sentence that he is already serving in Illinois. No parole, no appeal, no later technical maneuvering to reopen the case. The courtroom does not erupt. There's no dramatic confession, just procedural language, the kind that reduces decades of silence into a few lines entered into the record. Now, before his plea, Texas prosecutors had made it very clear that they were going to seek the death penalty, and they had the statutory framework to do it. They had multiple victims, kidnapping, prolonged captivity, torture, interstate conduct. And under Texas law, the case qualifies as capital murder. No doubt about that. It involves multiple persons, which is immediately capital murder. And in Texas, one was killed in Sutton County. The other was kidnapped in Texas and murdered after being transported across state lines.
Is that where you murder with the big letters?
Capital murder? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Instead of lowercase murder?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, if the state went to trial and secured a capital conviction with those special findings, execution was on the table. And I mean, there's multiple things there, like kidnapping or murder and murder with like another crime. Like if you murder because you're robbing somebody, that makes it capital. If you murder because you're committing rape, that makes it capital. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones. And every state's different.
Death penalty. Correct.
That's what qualifies it for the death penalty. Okay. And multiple states have different ones.
Things.
But as a general rule, they all kind of move along those lines. Murder of a police officer is usually instantly a capital case in all, states that have a capital punishment.
Officer, isn't it?
Well, what makes a federal crime punishable by death is completely different than how different states do it.
I meant like not just police, but like FBI. Anybody that's in that realm is an idiot.
100% yes. But the second that you kill a federal employee, it's a federal crime.
Okay.
Like if you kill a postman out delivering the mail, it will be prosecuted in federal court. It will not be a state court. Correct. It will be investigated by, I can't remember. I don't think it's the FBI. For some reason, I think that the Postal Service has like their own law enforcement wing. It's nice. The government. You got to have 20 agencies to do the work of one everywhere. But anyway, federal crimes are completely different. But in states, it's usually relatively the same thing, But if the state had gone to trial and secured the capital conviction with the special findings, obviously execution was on the table, and this is Texas where they actually do it. Mm-hmm. But capital cases are not quick, and they're not clean. They're a freaking nightmare. They do not end when the jury stands up. A capital conviction would have meant years, but more likely decades of automatic appeals, habeas filings, procedural challenges, mitigation hearings, and review. I mean, we saw it in the Dale Wayne Eaton case. Exactly the same. It's exactly what we're talking about.
Okay.
And there is no guarantee that an execution would ever actually occur. So instead, the plea locks in something different. Immediate conviction, immediate sentencing, no appellate runaway. And it is a hell of a lot harder to get an appeal on a life sentence than it is on a capital case. In a capital case, it's automatic. It's going to happen. And if it's not a capital case, an appellate court has to see a good reason to even consider it. Otherwise, they just kick it out. So it does clean that shit up a lot. So 2 capital murder convictions, 2 life without parole sentences, stacked on top of a third one. So if for any extraordinary reason the Illinois sentence were ever to be altered, like the bullshit that happened in the Chicago Ripper Crew case, I mean, that was a death penalty case, but still, that one asshat's out running around. So if Illinois decides to turn this piece of shit out, the Texas sentences remain. So he gets a one-way trip to Texas, and he won't leave Texas. If any court somewhere revisits any earlier conviction, Texas still gets to hold him. So there is no scenario under this structure in which he has any chance of walking free. So on paper, some might ask why Texas didn't push for execution, but it was not a symbolic defendant. This was a man that was already condemned to die in prison. Prosecutors were not negotiating with someone who might see the outside again. They were deciding how to secure permanent accountability with the least additional cost to the families and the greatest legal certainty. A capital trial would have required very graphic testimony, reconstruction of the prolonged captivity, the torture, all of that, multiple witnesses from multiple states, experts, and more importantly, family members that are forced to sit through every gory detail. And then after that, the years of appeals and the family having to go through that all the freaking time. So the plea deal avoids all of that. It provides immediate, irreversible accountability, and it spares the families having to relive the case repeatedly in appellate courts long after the headlines fade. It also frees up law enforcement to focus on something else, the unresolved edges of Rhoades' suspected series, which is extensive. Because as Texas closes with the Walsh Zyskowski counts, investigators across the country continue reviewing other cold cases along the same corridors. The plea does not shrink the larger universe of suspected victims. It simply secures these two. From a legal standpoint, March 2012 marks the pivot. Patricia and Douglas are no longer believed victims. They are no longer connected through inference and reconstruction alone because they are named victims in two capital murder convictions. The man responsible stands in court and he admits it. There's no trial transcript that stretches over weeks. There's no jury deliberation, just a defendant answering guilty to each count. It's restrained, procedural, measured, but it is final. And in cases that spanned Washington, Texas, Utah, Arizona, Illinois, and decades of delay, that finality matters. Because once the plea is entered, the story can no longer fragment. The record is unified. 2 names, 2 convictions, and a man who will never leave prison. And for the first time since 1990, the legal system is no longer asking what happened. It's stating what happened. That shift from question to a declaration is the beginning of the reckoning. So for families, March 2012 is not about strategy. It's not about capital punishment theory. It's not about prosecutorial leverage. It's about something much simpler. It's about an ending. By the time Rhoades stands in the West Texas courtroom, more than 20 years have passed since Candy and Douglas disappeared. 2 decades of missing person posters, 2 decades of unidentified remains in the separate states, 2 decades of fragmented answers. First they're missing, then Douglas was a John Doe in Texas, and Candy was a Jane Doe in Utah. Then there was a name attached to a serial killer and the realization that their story was not isolated. So by 2012, the families had lived through every freaking phase of uncertainty. And the plea ends that uncertainty, not emotionally, not existentially, but legally. Rhoades admits in open court that he killed them. He receives 2 life sentences without parole. He waives his right to any appeal. The case is no longer pending. It's no longer conditional. It's closed. Local reporting during that time framed it plainly. Justice had finally been brought to the families, and not because it erased what happened, but because it ended the question of whether anyone would ever be held responsible. And that question had hovered for more than 20 years. So now it was answered, and that's huge. And I'm not speaking from experience. I have no idea. I don't even pretend to know what these families went through.
Right.
But I can imagine what it must be like to look for a family member for years and years and years, and then find them murdered, and then years and years and years wondering what the hell happened. How in the hell did he die in Texas and his wife die in freaking Utah, or at least her body was found there? Like,
right.
Those questions.
Various degrees of hell.
Oh, God. I can't even imagine. And then the unfortunate part with a sick son of a bitch like this anyway, I mean, it's the case with every murder victim, but this one's especially bad. Then when you learn at least what she went through,
yeah,
then it's like it's a whole new realm of hell. So, but there's another piece of this that often gets lost. Without coordination, the families were facing the prospect of 2 separate murder trials. Utah had filed capital murder charges for Patricia's death. Texas had jurisdiction over Douglas, and potentially over both killings under its capital statutes. 2 trials would have meant 2 courtroom settings, 2 sets of prosecutors, 2 rounds of testimony, 2 cross-examinations, 2 full retellings of captivity and murder. Utah ultimately just stepped back and got out of the way, and that decision alone spared them from duplicating the trauma to these poor families. And then the plea deal spared them again. No weeks-long capital trial, no graphic evidence, the biggest thing is no appeals. And then, like I said before, Texas initially signaled that it was going to pursue the death penalty. If the case had gone to trial and resulted in a death sentence, there would have been a guilt phase, a punishment phase, victim impact testimony centered on whether he should live or die, and then years of automatic appellate review, and eventually, possibly, an execution date. But honestly, in this case, probably not. Because most likely, he's going to have to serve his life term in Illinois and then get sent to Texas to die. Yeah, it's obviously that's not going to happen. So there's no national media cycle that's revisiting the case every time an appeal is filed. Some people equate execution with ultimate justice, but the families chose the certainty instead. And, it's like I said, they worked with the families. It wasn't like they just made this sentence or made this plea up and then said, now you're stuck with it. I mean, they consulted the families, and the families, and it's hard. In a situation like this, as a family member, I can't even speak. I don't know what it would be, but
you don't know what
it is reasonable for me to think that I would be like, I never want him to get out. He's already doing life in Illinois. If the guy if this was the only charge, I'd be like, kill this son of a bitch, because I never want this sick son of a bitch ever to get out. But if they can broker a deal where there's no way he's getting out of prison, whatever. And again, I don't know, but just trying to put myself in their shoes in this situation, I think I probably might do the same thing. And they did end up getting a locked cell. They got the knowledge that he will die in prison, and they did get an end to the court appearances. That standoff is stark. No execution, no symbolic finality through the machinery of the state, but also no decades of appeals, no public spectacle, and no additional trauma in pursuit of punishment. And man, as you research these cases, or even just as a true crime buff and you watch the shows or do whatever, it's unreal what this does to families. These appeals are almost as cruel as what they went through originally. I was watching one.
Just shy of it.
And I often have something going on while I'm researching and stuff. And so I don't remember what the case was exactly, but I know I stopped to really pay attention when the father of the victim was talking, and he had said that it had been 30 years and he had never missed an appeal yet, and he wouldn't until the day he died. But I thought, 30 years. That was since the conviction.
Yeah.
That was 30 years of dealing with the appeals and then the parole hearings. It's cruel.
Yeah. It's disgusting.
And, closure is not the same thing as completeness. The plea answers the Walsh Zyskowski counts of murder, no doubt. But it does not answer every other disappearance along the highways that he traveled. It doesn't resolve the total number of victims. It does not reconstruct every mile or every stop. For the families, there is relief, but also limitation. They know what happened to Patricia and Douglas. They know who did it. They know that he admitted it. And they also know that many of the broader questions about his series will likely never fully be tried in open court. Justice here is precise: 2 names, 2 convictions, 1 offender who will never be let free. It's not dramatic or theatrical, but it is restrained. The families chose closure over spectacle. They chose certainty over a death penalty gamble. They chose 1 courtroom, 1 proceeding, 1 final record. And sometimes, especially after 22 years, that kind of quiet ending is the only kind that allows grief to move forward at all. The sound is smaller than you'd expect. Not dramatic, not thunderous, just wood meeting wood. A single knock of the gavel, and decades compress into a moment that lasts less than a second. The judge rises. The attorneys gather their files. The bailiff shifts position near the door. And just like that, the case is no longer active. In the gallery, the families don't move immediately. There's no applause, no visible relief, no cinematic confrontation, just a long exhale. The kind that doesn't come from victory, but from something just finally being over. Outside, the West Texas wind moves across the courthouse steps in the same way that it did before the hearing began. Cars pass, trucks roll down the highway. Life continues at its normal speed. Inside that courtroom, however, something fundamental has changed. For 22 years, the story of Patricia Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski existed as a question, missing, unidentified, unresolved. Now it exists as a record. 2 names spoken in open court, 2 capital convictions entered into law, a man who will never leave prison. There is no spectacle, only permanence. And sometimes, permanence is the only form accountability ever takes. So, if the Walsh-Zyskowski case is the reckoning, Regina Kay Walters is the blueprint. Her murder is the first case that forces the system to see this freaking piece of shit as the sexual assault defendant caught in Arizona, but something organized, mobile, and far more dangerous. And it is the clearest documented example of what Patricia Walsh likely endured inside that truck. This is a tough one. I tell everybody right now, this is a tough one. Regina Kay Walters was 14 years old. She was born May 5th, 1975. She was raised in the Houston, Texas area. And on February 3rd, 1990, she ran away with her 18-year-old boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones. They were teenagers chasing distance, planning to hitchhike out of Texas, talking about Mexico, talking about a life that felt bigger than they were. They were last seen accepting a ride from a truck driver. That truck driver was Robert Ben Rhoades. Investigators later reconstructed what happened next. Rhoades did what he would do again and again. He removed the male victim first. Ricky Jones was killed quickly after the pickup, shot and dumped near a highway in Mississippi during the outbound leg of Rhoades' route. His body was found, but at the time it wasn't connected to Regina. 2 young runaways became 2 separate, unlinked cases. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Just a little.
Yeah. Pattern is already visible. Eliminate the obstacle, isolate the girl, and then keep moving. Regina did not die immediately. She was kept alive for weeks. Inside the modified sleeper torture chamber, sick son of a bitch. Blah. God, this guy disgusts me.
Mm-hmm.
During that period, the details become disturbingly consistent with everything that investigators would later uncover. He cut her hair, uneven, acts short. That's his trademark, by the way. He always cuts their hair. He's a freaking weirdo. He shaved her pubic hair, another signature detail that FBI profilers would later note across victims. Witnesses would later remember seeing Rhoades with a distressed teenage girl with short, uneven hair at a loading dock. The girl in the photo, because eventually there was a photo. And at some point during those weeks, Rhoades drove Regina to an abandoned barn near Greenville, Illinois. And inside that barn, he photographed her. 14 years old, hair cut jagged and short, dressed in black, arms drawn up, terror visible in her face. It is one of the most haunting images in American true crime, not because it is graphic, but because it captures a living victim moments before her death. After the photos, he forced her into the hayloft. There, he strangled her with baling wire attached to a beam. He twisted the wire around her neck repeatedly. Her body remained in the loft for months. On September 29th, 1990, a farmer checking the structure before burning it down climbed into the hayloft and found her remains. And at that time, she too was a Jane Doe. Again, unidentified, unlinked, another fracture in the system. Now, while Regina's body lay in Illinois, her father in Texas began receiving anonymous phone calls. A man told him that he had, quote, made some changes to Regina. He referenced cutting her hair. He referenced leaving her in a barn. When her father asked if she was alive, the caller hung up. Those calls were later attributed to Rhoades. It was cruelty layered onto cruelty, control that extended beyond death. On April 1st, 1990, months before Regina's body was discovered, Arizona troopers arrested Rhoades after finding another woman chained in his truck near Casa Grande. 5 days later, investigators searched his Houston apartment, and what they found transformed the case. A London fog coat matching the one that Regina had been wearing when she disappeared, clothing believed to be hers, her notebook containing chilling phrases that suggested she had processed Ricky's death, and photographs, multiple photographs. Regina at different stages of the captivity, different hair lengths, different injuries, different poses. The barn photo was not a single image. It was part of a documented captivity. The photos proved duration. They proved method. They proved that this was not impulsive. It was structured. Regina's murder became the anchor homicide that was prosecuted in Illinois. Rhoades pled guilty. He received life without parole. He is in prison for her murder when Texas and Utah later moved forward with the Walsh and Zyskowski cases. But beyond the legal anchor, Regina provides something else. She provides the clearest template of his system. A hitchhiking couple, rapid elimination of the male, weeks of captivity in the sleeper, hair cutting and shaving as ritualized control, a final staged killing in a remote structure, photographic documentation as a trophy. When investigators later reconstruct what happened to Patricia and Douglas, they're not guessing blindly. They're overlaying Patricia's disappearance onto Regina's documented captivity, and the structure fit. El Paso instead of Houston, West Texas instead of Mississippi, Utah Canyon instead of an Illinois barn, but architecture is exactly the same. Regina was 14. Patricia was 24. Different ages, different circumstances, same interstate corridor, same truck, same offender. Regina's case is the reason that law enforcement finally understood what they were looking at. And it's the reason that Patricia's ordeal can be reconstructed with such chilling clarity. Without Regina, Rhoades might have remained just a violent trucker caught in Arizona. With Regina, he becomes what he was all along, a mobile predator using the American highway system as infrastructure. There are two other women who survived robber Ben Rhoades, two women who walked away from the sleeper cab alive. And without them, the system would not have understood what it was looking at. Their testimony did something that the crime scenes could not do. It gave the pattern a voice. On April 1st, 1990, Trooper Mike Miller stopped behind a semi on I-10 near Casa Grande, Arizona. Hazard lights were flashing. It looked routine. Inside the sleeper compartment, he found a nude woman chained, handcuffed at the wrists and ankles, a chain attached to a horse bridle around her head. Reporting later referred to her under the pseudonym Katie Ford, age 27. I don't know. At the station, she gave a videotape statement to Detective Rick Barnhart. Her account was not vague, it was structured. She said that Rhoades picked her up while she was hitchhiking from Rip Griffin truck stop north of Phoenix. And at first, he was very polite, he was professional, he was calm. Then he stopped the truck. And I just got to say, I didn't include it in this, and maybe I should have, but it would. I really struggle, and I don't want to. I don't want to go on into a whole series about a piece of shit killer. I'd rather focus on the victims. Maybe that's something I'll do in Distilled because that's a little bit more of the place for it. But I got to say, the son of a bitch met his last wife in a bar, and he was wearing a pilot's uniform. And they dated for a considerable amount of time. I can't remember if it was before or after they got married that she found out he was never a pilot. Like he lived this lie that he was a pilot.
Yeah.
So he was a manipulative master. So, you know, when these girls are like, yeah, he was super nice and stuff like that, you're like, why would you crawl into the cab? Well, you're dealing with a guy who's unbelievably good at this shit.
Yeah.
Like He can play it off that he's a pilot, and convincingly. And then he got into all kinds of weird sex stuff with her. And then he was unbelievably abusive during the marriage. But she was still married to him when he was convicted. They were separated. He had beat her for the last time, but they were still married. So he was kind of the quintessential serial killer. He was very good at faking it until, he didn't have to anymore. But so anyway, she said that he forced her into the sleeper, shackled her, and began to torture her. She described being whipped and beaten, punctured with sharp objects. Photographs taken after her rescue showed injuries that were consistent with her account, including pierced nipples and a labia inflicted with pointed implements. She told investigators that he said that he'd been doing this for about 15 years, that he got off on torture, that this wasn't new. It was routine. She said that he referred to himself in ways tied to sadomasochistic identity, phrases like whips and chains. And that's another thing. He tried to get his wife into to go to swingers clubs and into shit like that. He's a freaking freak, this guy. Detective Barnett immediately recognized that this was not a consensual BDSM encounter. The injuries, the restraints mounted in the sleeper, the configuration of the compartment, all pointed to systematic sadism. That arrest leads to the Arizona charges, but more importantly, it triggers federal law enforcement because now there is a living testimony describing a mobile torture chamber. And years before the Arizona truck stop, another woman in Houston had already escaped him. She reported being kidnapped from the Houston area, held in a truck sleeper for roughly 2 weeks, repeatedly tortured and raped. Her account mirrors what would later be documented in Arizona. Head shaved, pubic hair shaved, restrained and whipped, threatened with death. She believed that he intended to kill her. She escaped because one handcuff was not fully secured and she got out. She flagged down help. Houston police located a truck and driver matching her description. They brought her face to face with Rhoades and she looked down. She said it was not the man. Almost certainly out of fear. The case stalled. He walked away. Years later, when Arizona authorities compared her earlier statement to the Casa Grande survivor's testimony, the overlap was undeniable. It was the same type of truck, the same sleeper configuration, same shaving ritual, and that's a freaking odd one. Same whipping, same calm, smooth presentation, same Houston base of operations, 2 independent survivors describing the same system. And I saw your face when I said that she didn't recognize him, or that's so common. Yeah. It really is.
Well, until you said out of fear, I was like, what?
Yeah, and especially with sexual assault victims, it's very, very common. Unfortunately, but understandably. But without those survivors, Patricia Walsh's captivity would exist only as inference. But with them, investigators had a working template. They knew that he abducted women from truck stops and roadsides. He held them for extended periods in his sleeper cab. He shaved and altered their appearance as part of control or some sick fetish. I don't know. It's weird as shit. And it's not one that you hear a lot of.
Did they ever find the hair? Was he keeping it as trophies?
No, I never saw anything about the hair. I got nothing on that.
Okay.
It's so weird. Sometimes there's, certain elements that...
I was wondering if it was like an Ed Gein thing, like there's a box of hair tied in ribbons somewhere.
I don't really think so. I don't know if it was maybe like a forensic countermeasure, or if it was just some sick fetish. This guy had some really sick
Like, I have control
fetishes.
over you. Okay.
Like the whole BDSM thing and how do I say this without getting too vulgar? The 1980s, 1990s, that time period, I don't know, but I don't believe that a woman shaving her pubic regions was commonplace. And so maybe it was just like a sick fantasy thing. I don't know. I'm completely lost on that one. It's sick
to make them look younger, maybe?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I got nothing. I don't know.
Trying to understand him is not a fun thing.
Well, the sane cannot understand the insane, and this son of a bitch he's out there, man. Anyway, he documented their captivity. He spoke openly about his prior victims. They also knew something else. He was calm. He was polite. He was professional. When confronted by police in Arizona, he tried to frame the situation as consensual. The same persona is likely what Patricia and Douglas encountered on the roadside near El Paso.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I heard consensual and I lost my mind for a moment.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, like, when the cop crawled up into the cab, she started begging him not to rape her. And he's like, honey, I'm a cop. I'm law enforcement. Yeah. I'm gonna save you. But I mean, that's an indication of just how freaking traumatized.
Yeah, that sounds consensual to me.
Right. Yeah. So an older truck driver in a clean rig, a ride offered, a door open, trust exploited. Once inside, the control shifted, the door locks, the route, the speed, the isolation. The survivors gave law enforcement living, breathing evidence of the mechanism. Their injuries corroborated the configuration of the sleeper. Their statements corroborated the tools seized from his truck and apartment. And their descriptions of prolonged captivity allowed investigators to interpret what happened to Patricia, not as speculation, but as one more iteration of an already documented system. 2 women survived. They described the dungeon while it was still operational. They identified the architecture before it was dismantled. And because they spoke, when Texas and Utah reconstructed the silent crime scenes of Walsh and Zyskowski, they weren't guessing in the dark. They were following a pattern already described in detail by the women who lived. There's a moment in cases like this when the file feels complete. 2 names restored, 2 convictions entered, 1 offender locked away, the gavel falls, the paperwork closes, the system moves on, but the highways don't. I-10 doesn't stop running west out of Texas. I-15 doesn't stop at the county line in Utah. Truck stops don't shut down because one courtroom reached a verdict. For years, possibly decades, that truck moved through the same corridors, the same interstates, the same rest areas, the same shoulders where people stood with backpacks and cardboard signs. 2 victims are now formally accounted for in Texas, 1 in Illinois, but the structure that enabled those crimes, the mobility, the isolation, the fragmentation across jurisdictions, existed long before Patricia and Douglas ever stepped onto that roadside. And it didn't disappear when Regina's case was filed. When investigators began mapping his routes, they weren't just retracing one trip. They were looking at least 15 years of freight runs, 15 years of way stations, 15 years of truck stops, 15 years of vulnerable travelers moving through the same spaces. The question shifts, not did he kill Walsh and Zyskowski? That has been answered. But the question becomes, how many times did the pattern repeat before someone finally stopped him? 2 convictions close a case. They don't necessarily close a series. And that's where the scope widens. So if we widen the lens beyond Patricia, Douglas, and Regina, precision matters because in cases like this, the number can drift wildly. Rumor becomes headline, headline becomes a fact. So let's draw a clear line. There are 3 murders that Robert Ben Rhoades has been legally held accountable in court for. Everything beyond that is investigative belief, but it's not adjudicated fact. So we have the confirmed cases. Regina Kay Walters, 14. We've talked all through that. Candy Walsh, 24. Douglas Zyskowski, 28. Those 3 names resulted in the life sentences. And then Ricky Lee Jones, Regina's boyfriend, is almost certainly another victim. Investigators believe that Rhoades killed him shortly after pickup, but he was never formally charged in his death. I don't know. 3 proven murders, 1 highly probable additional homicide. That is what exists in the legal record. Beyond that, law enforcement summaries and later reporting describes something far larger. He is suspected of torturing, raping, and killing more than 50 women between roughly 1975 and 1990. The number is not derived from 50 bodies that have been tied to him. It comes from 15 years of documented long-haul trucking routes, interstate corridors that are dense with missing person reports, a preferred victim profile, hitchhikers, runaways, sex workers, women at truck stops. And it's like, I mean, every freaking person that we've talked about on this entire series, this whole season of Rocky Mountain fits those.
Yeah.
Statements that he made to survivors claiming that he'd been doing this for about 15 years, photographs of unidentified women recovered from his truck and apartment. Some 1990s law enforcement assessments quoted officials as believing that by early 1990, he may have been kidnapping and murdering an average of 3 women a month. If true, that math produces terrifying numbers. But again, that is investigative belief. It's not courtroom proof. So when you hear up to 50, understand what investigators are doing. They were overlaying his trucking logs, his freight routes, his clusters of missing women along those highways, the physical evidence of a structured torture system. And they were asking, if he had the infrastructure, if he had the opportunity, if he demonstrated repeat behavior, how many times could this have occurred before someone stopped him? The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative treats Rhoades as one of several long-haul truckers believed to have potentially have very high victim counts. But there is no official court-validated roster of 50 names. The estimate reflects scale, but not proof. Investigators have long believed the Regina template likely repeated. Runaway couple, male killed quickly, female kept alive, but only Regina's case resulted in a conviction. Authorities also examined unidentified women found near interstate corridors that he frequented, particularly in the Southwest and the Great Basin regions. Some of those cases, like we've been talking about all season, were once loosely grouped under a general label of the Great Basin murders or the Great Basin serial killer victims, and Rhoades is definitely considered as a possible contributor to that, but there's no formal determination that he accounts for all of them, obviously, or even most of those homicides. And then there are the photographs. Investigators seized numerous bondage photos of unidentified women and girls from his apartment and truck. Some women in those photos were later located and identified as survivors, but others remain unknown. Unknown faces, unknown fates. Those images are a major driver of the dozens estimate because they suggest repetition, because they suggest time, and because they suggest that he had not been interrupted often. So here is the clean version. 3 murders are legally proven. Investigators believe he likely killed many more, possibly up to 50, based on the route analysis, the missing person patterns, survivor accounts, and the photographic evidence. But those additional victims are not named in court. They're not adjudicated. They're investigated conclusions about scale. And that's important because the system can only punish what it can prove. The highways may hold more stories, but in a courtroom, there's 3. And everything beyond that remains, at least for now, unresolved. There's a difference between a crime scene and infrastructure. A crime scene is opportunistic. Infrastructure is engineered. This asshat did not simply assault victims in whatever space he happened to control. He retrofitted his workspace. He engineered the sleeper compartment of a long-haul truck into a secure holding cell. Welded restraints, mounted hardware, a curated torture kit. a controlled environment that was designed for prolonged captivity. That's important because in behavioral analysis, that kind of investment almost never signals a small number of crimes. Rhoades didn't improvise violence, he modified his primary workspace to facilitate it. That level of planning, altering the physical structure of a vehicle, carrying specialized tools, refining the procedures, is consistent with what FBI profilers classify as a highly organized, sexually sadistic serial offender. Not someone who's offended once, not someone who lost control in the heat of the moment, someone who built a system. Frank Figliuzzi and others discussing the FBI's Highway Serial Killers Initiative have pointed to Rhoades as a textbook example of a trucker who weaponized his rig, creating what investigators would later call a traveling torture chamber. And not for a weekend, for years. The documented cases alone show weeks of captivity of Regina Walters, extended torture of the Arizona survivor, prolonged detention described by the Houston survivor. That is repetition. That's refinement. It's not experimentation. In behavioral terms, Rhoades fits the organized, predatory, itinerant killer profile. He prepared tools in advance. He altered his environment to maximize control. He selected vulnerable victims intentionally. He used social competence to gain access. He disposed of victims across jurisdictions to fracture the investigations. Organized sexual sadists rarely stop after one or two crimes. Research and casework show that offenders who invest this much in infrastructure tend to offend repeatedly over long periods, refining their methods, improving concealment, increasing confidence. Rhoades told at least one survivor that he had been doing this for 15 freaking years. That statement aligns disturbingly well with his trucking timeline, mid-1970s through 1990. If that window's accurate, then the 3 murders proven in court represent only a tiny portion that investigators could anchor to hard evidence. And you got to think about this. What we know about these pieces of shit is they learn, they adapt, they improve. So, it would be very, very, very unlikely that somebody would, as a truck driver, take his truck, modify it in all the ways that he did, and then try it out one time.
Yeah.
Almost certainly he started just by tying his victims up. And then he was like, you know what? It'd be really great if I had something to tie him to. And then he probably tried it and was like, well, that didn't work. Next time I'm going to, this is years of
I have to shut a door and keep it quiet. And,
yeah, this is years of trial and error.
Yeah.
So
disgusting.
And scary as shit is what it is. So now add the job. Long haul trucking provides a mobile crime scene, constant interstate movement, ready access to hitchhikers, runaways, and sex workers at truck stops, built-in jurisdictional fragmentation. Pick them up in Texas, hold them in Louisiana, drive through Mississippi, kill them and dump them in Illinois. No single department sees the whole arc. The truck becomes both transportation and confinement. When that mobile environment has been physically engineered for torture, behavioral analysis do not assume a small victim pool. They assume scale. And this is where the investigative estimate enters. When agents talk about up to 50 victims, they're not citing 50 indictments, but they are extrapolating from 15 years of documented routes, survivor testimony, photographs, presence of his freaking sick-ass torture chamber. And like I said, you do not weld restraints into a sleeper cab for a one-time offense.
Right.
You do not maintain portable torture kits for 3 isolated incidents. The chamber itself is a behavioral red flag. It signals longevity. It signals repetition. It signals comfort with the process. And still, we have to remain precise. 3 murders are proven in court. Everything beyond that is investigative assessment. But when profiling experts say the probability of only 3 victims is extremely low, they are not speculating widely. They are reading behavior. They're reading infrastructure. They're reading time. Rhoades' chamber wasn't a disturbing footnote. It was a system. And a system of that scale rarely produces single-digit outcomes. Walsh, Zyskowski, Walters. Those are the names the courts could confirm. The chamber suggests the story is much larger. Much, much larger. There's another version of this story. In that version, the bones in Millard County are buried under a case number and never revisited. In that version, a Texas file marked missing couple fades into storage and never gets reopened. In that version, evidence seized from a Houston apartment in 1990 is boxed, mislabeled, or quietly discarded when the shelves get crowded. And in that version, Patricia Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski never come home in name. The highways keep running, the trucks keep moving in memory, the file stays fractured because interstate crime does not fail loudly. It fails quietly. One jurisdiction closes its part, another never sees the connection, a third assumes someone else handled it. Pre-NamUs, pre-centralized databases, pre-digital cross-matching. Back then, linking Texas, Utah, Illinois, or Washington required people picking up phones, not software running overnight. And most of the time, that didn't happen. The case did not resolve because the system was seamless. It resolved because certain pieces did not get lost. Bones were kept, x-rays were retained, truck evidence was preserved. A ranger reopened a file instead of shelving it again. If any one of those pieces disappears, the story never reconnects. The fractures from episode 1 remain permanent. No dramatic collapse, no scandal headline. Just two people who stay unidentified, two murders that remain separate, and a truck that keeps moving through history without a name attached to it. That is the version that almost happened. And that's where the real lesson begins. So in episode 1, we talked about fracture, we talked about distance, the jurisdictional walls, everything. No shared databases, cops that wanted to protect their boundaries, all of that shit. The Walsh-Zyskowski case lives inside of those fractures, and it almost stayed there. Look at the geography again. A married couple from Washington State. Last heard from near El Paso, Texas. Douglas found off I-10 in rural Sutton County, Texas, and Patricia left near I-15 in Millard County, Utah. The offender living in Houston was first convicted in Illinois. 5 states, multiple counties, separate court systems. That spread is exactly the kind of pattern that the FBI Serial Killers Initiative was later created to address. Clusters of disappearances along interstate corridors where long-haul drivers can offend in one state and be gone by the end of their shift. But in 1990, there wasn't such an initiative. No shared map, no national task force assuming that a Jane Doe in Utah might possibly connect to a missing couple from Seattle and a trucker based in Houston. There was only isolated files, and isolation is what this total piece of shit relied on. When Patricia and Douglas were killed, NamUs did not exist. No national missing unidentified cross-match system, no automatic database comparison. Seattle had a missing couple. Sutton County had a male John Doe homicide. Millard County had a female Jane Doe. None of these systems talk to each other. Unless someone physically picked up the phone and called another agency, those files lived in separate universes. Even Douglas's identification was delayed in part by a bad data entry into the missing persons system, a small clerical mistake with massive consequences. That's how fragile it was. One typo, one missed phone call, and a body stays unidentified for years. This case did not survive because the system was efficient. It survived because certain people did not throw things away. Patricia's remained set in a Millard County evidence storage for 13 years, labeled as Jane Doe, preserved, untouched. Items that were seized from Asshat in 1990, textiles, photographs, physical evidence from his truck and apartment, were kept long enough for DNA technology to catch up. That is not glamorous police work. It is not headline material. It is a property room decision. Do we purge this or do we hold on to it? If Millard County had buried remains without retention of x-rays, if evidence from Houston had been destroyed during a routine purge, if the Texas Ranger had never reopened the file, the fracture would have remained permanent. There would be no DNA comparison, no dental matches, no stacked life sentences in Texas, just 3 disconnected tragedies. The key scenes in this story are not major metropolitan homicide units. They are rural sheriff's offices, Sutton County, Texas, Millard County, Utah, small staffs, limited budget, huge geography. We've talked about it over and over again this season. They recovered bodies in remote terrain with no immediate leads. They opened homicide files without knowing those files were part of something national, but they kept the evidence for decades. When coordination finally happened, when Texas called Utah, when federal labs retested preserved materials, it worked because those rural agencies had preserved the foundation, not because they had cutting-edge systems in 1990, because they held on to what they had. Episode 1 showed you the scenes. No ID, no national database, distance measured in hundreds of miles, jurisdictional silos. Episode 3 shows you what prevented permanent failure. A ranger willing to revisit an old case. A rural county that kept skeletal remains and x-rays. Evidence storage decisions that allowed DNA to be retested years later. Agencies willing to cooperate across state lines instead of guarding their turf. This is not a policy lecture. It's a reminder of how thin the margin was. If Utah had not preserved the remains, if Texas had not reopened the case, if 1990 evidence had been purged in 1995, Patricia Waltz might still be Jane Doe. Douglas might still be a roadside unknown. Rhoades would still be serving life in Illinois, but without their names attached. The indictment is obvious. Interstate crime in the pre-NamUs era was built for disappearance. Data silos made fragmentation easy. Small mistakes cause years of delay. But there is also a quieter endorsement. Preservation matters. Cold cases are not dead if evidence survives. Rural agencies are not insignificant. They are often the ones that are holding the key pieces. Programs like NamUs and the Highway Serial Killings Initiative exist precisely because cases like this exposed how vulnerable the seams were. Walsh and Zyskowski slipped into those seams in 1990. They did not stay there because enough people refused to let the fracture remain permanent. And that is the systemic lesson. Not that the system worked smoothly, but that it worked eventually because someone kept the bones. I've said it before on this show, the death penalty terrifies me, and not because I have sympathy for these total pieces of shit, but because the system is imperfect, and when the state kills the wrong person, there is no undo button. But let's not pretend that this case sits in some gray moral space. Weeks of torture, engineered captivity, photographs taken like trophies, a teenage girl strangled with baling wire in a hayloft after being held and humiliated, a newlywed couple picked up in faith and carved into pieces across 4 states. There is nothing ambiguous about what he is. And if anyone listening feels the instinctive reaction, this man deserves to die, well, that reaction is not irrational. It is human.
And you're not alone.
I can't imagine that I am.
Yeah. They're speaking to them. They're not alone.
Yes, you are not alone in that thought. The question isn't whether the impulse makes sense. The question is whether the system exists to mirror that impulse. Legally, this is finished. He has multiple life without parole sentences in 2 states. There is no procedural path for him to walk free, ever. There is no parole board hearing waiting in the future. There is no clock that's ticking towards release. This son of a bitch will die in prison. That is certainty. For Walsh and Zyskowski families, local reporting framed the plea as justice finally delivered. He admitted what he did. He stood in court and he named them. The record now says permanently that he killed Patricia Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski, but enough isn't a legal term. It's a moral one. And no sentence, not life, not death, gives back 20 years of not knowing. No sentence restores Patricia's life. No sentence restores Douglas's. No sentence names the dozens of suspected victims whose faces are still only photographs in an evidence box. So when you ask whether life without parole is enough, we're not really asking about prison. We're asking whether any system can balance what was taken. Texas? No. Texas could have pursued death. Instead, prosecutors traded that possibility for something else. Guilty pleas, no appeals, stacked life sentences, immediate finality. Like we talked about, a capital trial would have meant graphic testimony, a separate punishment phase, years, maybe decades of appellate litigation, repeated court appearances, reopened wounds. Research with homicide survivors shows something uncomfortable. Executions rarely deliver the closure that people imagine. In many cases, they prolong trauma because families are forced to relive the case through appeal after appeal after appeal. In this case, the plea spared the families that cycle. No execution countdown, no 20-year litigation arc, no standing in court every few years to argue about whether he should live or die. Instead, they received something narrower but more concrete. He admitted it. He'll never be free. It's over for them. Whether that trade was right depends entirely on what you believe the justice system is for. Is it for punishment and symbolism, or is it for certainty and harm reduction for the living? Victim advocates are blunt about this word closure. Many families hate it. I hate it. There is no emotional finish line after a homicide. There is no day when grief resolves because a judge signs some paperwork.
Right.
What the Walsh and Zyskowski families received was not closure. It was containment. Answers as much as the system could provide, accountability in a courtroom under oath, containment. No more trials, no more appeals, no more watching him manipulate the system. But that doesn't heal anything. But it does allow life to move forward without the case constantly ripping open the same wound. That is different from closure. It's much quieter, and sometimes it is the most that a system can realistically offer. There's another uncomfortable truth here. If the state had executed him, would it have balanced what he did? Would Patricia's life feel restored? Would Regina's terror be erased? Would the unnamed woman in his photographs be given back their stolen years? Execution might feel proportional to weeks of torture, but proportional punishment and emotional repair are not the same thing. This case forces us to sit in that tension. He is not redeemable. He's not misunderstood. He engineered suffering. And yet the system stopped at life. But not because he deserved mercy, but because certainty was chosen over spectacle. Legally, institutions decide. Prosecutors negotiate, judges sentence, appeals courts review, parole boards, when they exist, evaluate release. In this case, those institutions have done all that they can do. Multiple life sentences, no paroles, no appeals. Morally and personally, though, only the families get to decide what feels complete. Some may have wanted execution. Others clearly wanted the process to end. And systematically, zoom out. Justice is incomplete. There are suspected victims who will never be charged. There are remains along interstate corridors that may never be found or named. There are fractures in the system that still exist for other families whose cases don't end with a plea deal. The system did what it could. It named the dead. It caught the man who killed him. It ensured that he'll never walk free again. But justice here is bounded by time, by missing data, by the limits of proof, by the reality that some harm cannot be proportionally answered. And closure? That isn't something a courtroom can manufacture. At best, the law can remove uncertainty. It can remove the danger. It can remove spectacle. Cannot remove grief. So maybe the cleanest way to say it is this: the son of a bitch deserved to die in the emotional sense. The system delivered permanence instead. And for the families, permanence may have been the more merciful form of finality. There's something uncomfortable about ending this story neatly. 3 murders proven in court, 3 names recorded in judgments, 3 life sentences stacked on top of each other like a legal wall that will never come down. It sounds complete, it sounds contained, but it isn't. Because anyone who looks at this case honestly, not emotionally, not dramatically, but behaviorally, knows 3 is not the real number. You do not weld restraints into a sleeper cab for 3 crimes. You don't refine a portable torture kit over 15 years for 3 crimes. You do not tell a captive woman that you've been doing this for about 15 years if the total count is 3. It is naive and frankly insulting to the evidence to pretend that the only victims are the ones that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. There are others. We can't name them. We can't charge for them. We can't bring them into the courtroom and read their names into the record, but they exist. There are women who were picked up at truck stops and survived, women who escaped because a cuff wasn't tightened enough, women who lived but never spoke about it publicly, women who spoke once and then disappeared back into their private life. There are women whose photographs were seized from a house and a truck, faces that investigators could not immediately match to missing person reports. Some were found, some were never identified. And then there are the darker possibilities. The Jane Doe along interstate corridors, the unidentified remains found near highways that he traveled, the couples who vanished and were never linked. Are they all his? No one can say that responsibly. But is it realistic to believe there were no more murders? That 3 is the ceiling? No. Not when the behavioral pattern screams repetition. Not when the infrastructure for captivity was permanent. Not when the geography gave him endless access and jurisdictional fragmentation. Not when his own statements, his routes, and the evidence seized point to a long, methodical career. The honest answer is this: we do not know whether the number is 1 more, or 10 more, or 20, or 50, and we're probably never going to know. And that uncertainty is its own kind of violence, because every unidentified woman found near an interstate during those years becomes a question mark. Every missing hitchhiker along I-10, I-15, I-80 becomes a question. Every face in a photograph that investigators couldn't immediately match becomes a question. And questions don't get victim tributes. Names do. That's why we're going to widen the lens in this tribute. Patricia Waltz and Douglas Zyskowski will always be the center of this arc. Regina Kay Walters will always be central to understanding the pattern, but they are not the only ones touched by this man. There are survivors whose stories never became headlines. There are families who may never get a courtroom admission. There are victims who exist only as case numbers, skeletal remains, or missing posters curling on old corkboards. We cannot prove them in court, but we can acknowledge them in truth, because justice is not only about what can be indicted. It's also about what can be recognized. And recognition matters. Even when the system cannot assign a case number, even when there is no trial, even when the file sits in a rural evidence room waiting for a name. So when we move into this tribute, it will not be limited to the legally proven. It will honor the known, and it will leave space for the unknown. For the women who survived and never spoke again. For the ones who were photographed and identified years later. For the ones who may still be out there, unnamed, waiting for someone to connect the right dots. Because if this case teaches us anything, it's this: proof is a legal threshold. Victimhood is not. And the map of harm in this story is larger than any courtroom could ever fully contain. So before we begin this victim tribute, we need to slow the pace like we always do. Stories like this move quickly once the system catches up. Indictments, pleas, sentencing, finality. But remembrance doesn't move at the speed of court calendars. It asks something quieter of us. This moment is not about legal outcomes. It's not about investigative theory. It is not about body counts or sentencing debates. It is about people. Patricia Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski were not chapters in a serial offender's timeline. They were not a case. They were a married couple at the beginning of their life together, traveling with purpose, anchored in faith, believing the road ahead was something to be embraced, not feared. Their story did not begin on an interstate shoulder. It began long before that, in families, in friendships, in conviction, in hope, and it deserves to be remembered in that fuller light. In this episode, we're also going to widen that circle because while Patricia and Douglas are the names that we can honor with certainty, we know they were not alone in the harm that radiated outward from this sorry son of a bitch. There are survivors whose strengths kept them alive. There are victims whose names never made it into an indictment. There are faces once captured in photographs that took years to identify. There may be others still unnamed. This tribute holds space for all of them. And as part of that remembrance, we continue our collaboration with the J.J. Hawk Band, whose music accompanies these victim tributes across the series. Their work, produced through Hawk Studios, is not meant to dramatize the story or to interpret it. It's meant to create room, a steady, respectful backdrop against which we can remember without intrusion. The song you're about to hear is called Point of No Return. It reflects that irreversible moment when a path is altered, not as spectacle, but as quiet finality, a recognition that something sacred has been taken and cannot be restored to what it once was. As the music plays beneath this tribute, we ask you to listen gently, not for legal conclusions, not for investigative insight, but for the lives that existed before the case and for the futures that should have been allowed to unfold. This is Point of No Return by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Patricia Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski. As the music continues beneath us, this final tribute widens. It begins where the court record ends. Patricia Candy Walsh Zyskowski, Douglas Scott Zyskowski, Regina Kay Walters. 3 names entered into judgments. 3 names attached to life sentences. 3 lives the legal system can say with certainty were taken by the same man. Patricia was 24 years old, a woman of conviction, a newlywed stepping into adulthood with belief, with direction, with the kind of quiet faith that makes you assume the world will meet you halfway. She was traveling beside her husband, not chasing recklessness, not inviting harm, simply moving forward. Her story did not begin on a highway shoulder. It began years earlier in classrooms, in friendships, in family kitchens, in church pews, in laughter that had nothing to do with danger. Douglas was 28, a husband, a son, a man who believed he could navigate risk and protect the person beside him. When he stood on the side of that road, he did not stand as a statistic. He stood as someone with plans, a future measured in decades, not in minutes. His life was not defined by where he was left. It was defined by who he was before that moment. Regina was 14, a child, 14 years old enough to believe that she could start over somewhere else, and too young to understand what kind of predator moves through truck stops and highways. Her final photograph is the one people recognize, but it is not the whole of her. Before that barn, she was a daughter, a girl with friends, a person with a voice and a personality and a future that stretched far beyond one catastrophic encounter. 3 confirmed murders, but this tribute does not stop at 3 because no one builds a chamber like that for a single experiment. No one refines cruelty over 15 years and leaves only 3 victims in their wake. Violence that methodical, that engineered, that rehearsed, it accumulates. We know there were survivors. The woman found chained in Arizona, terrified, brutalized, but alive. The woman in Houston who escaped when a handcuff wasn't secured. Others who may have walked away and never reported. Others who reported and were not believed. Others who survived and chose silence because survival itself required it. Their lives are part of this story too. And then there are the unnamed. The women in photographs seized from an apartment and a truck. Faces frozen in fear. Some later identified as survivors, others never located. Some who may still be out there, living quietly with memories they never asked to carry. Some who may not have survived at all. There are unidentified remains found near highways that fit patterns but never fit a courtroom narrative. There are missing persons along interstate corridors whose files sit in drawers and databases without a confirmed link. There are families who still wonder whether a long-haul truck driver passed through their daughter's last known location. We don't know the number. It may be one more, it may be 10, 20, 50, but absence of indictment does not equal absence of harm. What we know from behavior, from engineering, from pattern, from time, is that this violence did not occur in isolation. It unfolded across years and states, across thousands of miles of asphalt. It intersected with lives that we can name and lives that we can't. So this final tribute expands beyond the legal boundary of conviction. It honors Patricia and Douglas, whose love story was interrupted but not erased. It honors Regina, whose name was restored after she was once labeled only as Jane Doe. It honors Ricky Lee Jones, whose death is nearly certain, though never formally adjudicated in court. It honors the Arizona survivor who endured torture and told investigators what she saw. It honors the Houston survivor who escaped a chain that was meant to end her life. It honors every unidentified woman whose image was recovered from a box of photographs and still sits waiting for a name. It honors every family whose missing person report never intersected with the right database at the right time. It honors the possibility, the near certainty that there are graves that we do not know about and stories we will never fully reconstruct. Because this story is not about the offender's mythology. It is not about the architecture of his cruelty. It is not about the interstate map that he used as camouflage. It is about human beings who existed long before he entered their lives. Patricia had a childhood. Douglas had dreams. Regina had a laugh and favorite songs and ordinary teenage moments that deserved to multiply into adulthood. The unnamed had birthdays. The survivors had futures they had to rebuild from trauma. None of them were chapters in a serial narrative. They were people. And if there are more, and there are, then they deserve space in this tribute too. Not because we can list them, and not because we can prosecute their cases, but because acknowledging them matters. The system can only convict what it can prove, but remembrance is not limited to indictments. So, as Point of No Return continues to play beneath this final tribute stands for all of them. For the 3 whose names are written into court records, for the one whose death was almost certainly his, even if never charged, for the survivors who lived, for the unidentified who wait, for the missing whose families still search. You are not numbers attached to a speculative body count. You are not footnotes in a highway map. You are not evidence tags in a property room. You are remembered. Patricia, Douglas, Regina, and to every victim, known, suspected, unnamed, and still undiscovered, you are not forgotten.
If the cost is everything, I'm not lost.
So that concludes this episode of Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning. If you believe in action over outrage, consider joining the Dark Dialogue Collective. This is not a donation tier. It's a boots-on-the-ground volunteer work, physical searches, victim support, direct assistance to families who are still waiting for answers. If you want to stand up in the real world, that's where you do it.
We also invite you to participate in our Adoptive Victim program at darkdialogue.com. These are unresolved cases only. You can adopt a victim, research their case, work to identify unnamed remains, or help pursue the name of an unidentified offender. Real cases, real research, real impact. Our full victim tribute blog posts are available at www.darkdialogue.com, where each life is remembered in detail and preserved permanently.
If you want to support the work financially, patreon.com/darkdialoguepod, Ko-fi, kofi.com/darkdialogue, Substack at darkdialoguecrime.substack.com. For case tips, collaboration, or inquiries, you can always reach us at info@darkdialogue.com.
Don't forget to stay connected with the entire Dark Dialogue network, the main show, Distilled, Unraveled Truths, Gallows and Gunfights, and Shadow Chat sessions. If this episode mattered to you, help us grow this work. Like the episode, follow the show, subscribe on your platform, leave a review. On YouTube, hit the thumbs up and ring the bell so you never miss an episode, and share it with someone who believes that truth still matters.
We'll see you next time. Stay safe out there, look out for each other, keep listening, make the guilty face the reckoning.